Welcome back to ABA Chapter Chat, where we like to take these complex ABA concepts
Yeah,
and try to make them practical for all of you out there in the field.
absolutely.
Today,
For sure.
we are tackling something that I think just about every behavior analyst out there who supervises staff has struggled with.
Oh, yeah.
How to effectively,
At some point.
yeah, at some point, how to effectively supervise when staff performance isn't quite meeting expectations.
It's a tough one.
It's really tough. And we're lucky to have some guidance from Chapter 8, Correcting Non-Proficient Work Performance of the Supervisor's Guidebook.
Great chapter.
So before we jump into actually, correcting performance problems, this chapter emphasizes some really crucial prerequisites.
Yes.
Like what are the things we need to have in place before we can even think about, addressing someone's performance?
That's a great point because it's like building a house.
Yeah.
You can't just, start putting up the walls.
Right.
Without a solid foundation.
Yeah.
And supervision is the same way. If you haven't laid the groundwork first, any attempt to correct performance is going to be shaky at best.
Okay, so what does that foundation look like?
Well, the guidebook breaks it down into 4 key areas. And the first is you have to clearly specify your performance expectations for your staff.
Okay.
So that means having well-defined job descriptions, written policies, and procedures,
Right.
making sure that everyone on your team understands exactly what's expected of them.
So it's not enough to just, assume everyone knows what they're supposed to be doing. It has to be spelled out, clearly.
Exactly. Then there's training. You need to make sure your staff are properly trained on, all the skills they need to be able to perform their job effectively.
Yeah.
And this could involve, workshops or online modules, hands-on practice, maybe even mentoring by more experienced staff.
Right, because if someone's, struggling with a task, maybe it's not a motivation issue. Maybe they just, haven't been given the tools to succeed.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the third part of the foundation is routine performance monitoring.
Okay.
So this means regularly observing your staff, providing feedback, collecting data on their performance so that you can identify any areas where they might be struggling.
So it's not just about, waiting for problems to kind of pop up. It's about being proactive and checking in regularly, making sure everyone's on track.
Right. And finally, the fourth element of this foundation is actively supporting quality staff performance.
Oh.
So this means recognizing and praising staff when they're doing things well, providing them with the resources they need, and creating a positive and supportive work environment.
Yeah, I think that last part is so crucial because, we often get so caught up in fixing problems that we forget to kind of acknowledge and celebrate all the good work that's happening.
Yeah.
And that can be really demotivating for staff.
It's true. And when you consistently reinforce quality work, it actually makes your corrective actions more effective when you do need to provide them.
That's interesting. How so?
Well, think about it. If you're constantly being negative and only pointing out what people are doing wrong, they're eventually going to just tune you out.
Right.
But if you're regularly acknowledging and appreciating their good work, then when you do need to provide some constructive feedback, it's going to stand out more and it's going to have a greater impact.
Yeah, it's like you're building up, trust and credibility.
Yeah.
So that when you do need to, kind of correct someone, they know it's coming from a place of support and not just criticism.
Exactly. And it also helps to create a more positive work environment.
Yeah.
Which can lead to, better staff morale, lower turnover, and ultimately better outcomes for the individuals we serve.
Okay, so we've got our foundation in place, we've got clear expectations, we've got effective training going on, regular monitoring and active support happening.
Right.
What happens when, despite all of this, someone's performance still isn't meeting expectations?
Well, that's when we need to start thinking about corrective supervision.
Okay.
But here's a common misconception that I think this chapter really highlights. But corrective supervision isn't just about punishment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to emphasize because, people often picture the supervisor, breathing down their neck, just waiting to pounce on every mistake.
Right. And that's not effective supervision at all. In fact, the guidebook really stresses that consistently supporting quality work is absolutely crucial for corrective supervision to be successful.
So it's not about being negative all the time. It's about finding that balance between support and accountability.
Right. And when you're providing corrective feedback, it's important to do it in a way that's constructive and helpful, not just critical.
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
So let's talk about some of the common reasons why staff performance might be off. What are some of the things that supervisors might encounter?
Well, the guidebook outlines 4 main culprits. The first is a lack of skills.
Okay.
Sometimes staff simply haven't been adequately trained to perform certain tasks.
Right.
Or maybe they received training a while back but have forgotten some of the key elements.
Sure. Yeah.
So in those cases, the solution is more training.
Right.
But, it's important to assess the situation carefully before, you just launch into a full-blown training session.
Yeah.
You need to figure out if the staff member has ever received training on this particular skill. If not, then providing training would be the next step. But if they have received training in the past, you might just need to provide some targeted refreshers or coaching on the specific aspects that they're struggling with.
Right. So, for example, let's say you have a staff member who's having a hard time implementing, behavior intervention plans consistently.
Right.
Maybe they just need like a quick refresher on how to, collect data or how to implement specific strategies.
Exactly. Now, imagine a different scenario. A staff member is tasked with running social skills groups for clients, but they're consistently struggling to, keep the clients engaged and on task.
Yeah.
What could be going on there?
Well, my first thought is, do they have the resources they need to do the job effectively? Maybe they're lacking appropriate materials, or maybe the environment isn't conducive to running a group.
That's a great point. Sometimes what looks like a staff performance issue is actually a resource or scheduling problem.
Yeah.
It's the supervisor's job to figure out if the staff member is truly lacking the skills to do the job, or if there are external factors that are preventing them from succeeding.
So it's like being a detective. You have to kind of gather all the clues before you can make a diagnosis.
Exactly. And sometimes the solution might be as simple as, providing the staff member with more materials or adjusting their schedule to give them more time to prepare for the group.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
What's another common reason for performance issues?
Well, the third one can be a bit more sensitive. It's what the guidebook refers to as incapability.
Okay.
And this is when a staff member might be physically or mentally unable to perform certain tasks, despite having the skills and the resources.
So, for example, a staff member who's responsible for lifting and transferring clients might develop a back injury that prevents them from doing that safely.
Right. Or a staff member who's responsible for providing intensive behavioral intervention might have a learning disability that makes it difficult for them to master certain teaching techniques.
Oh, yeah, those are definitely tough situations.
Yeah.
How does a supervisor handle those?
Well, the first step is to explore workplace accommodations.
Okay.
Can you adjust the job demands to better suit the staff member's capabilities? For instance, maybe the staff member with the back injury could be assigned to a role that doesn't involve lifting. Or maybe the staff member with the learning disability could be paired with a mentor who can provide extra support.
So it's about being creative and trying to find solutions that benefit both the staff member and the agency.
Exactly. But if accommodations aren't feasible, you might need to consider reassigning the staff member to a different role within the agency.
Okay.
That better aligns with their strengths.
And if that's not possible?
Well, that's when we're faced with a really difficult decision.
Yeah.
If reasonable accommodations and reassignment aren't possible and the staff member's limitations are impacting client care, termination might be necessary.
I can imagine that's a really, really tough call to make. But ultimately, the well-being of both the staff and the clients has to be the top priority.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that termination should always be the last resort after all other options have been exhausted.
Right, for sure. So we've talked about lack of skills. We've talked about insufficient resources and incapability. What's that fourth common culprit behind non-proficient performance?
This is the one that I think probably many supervisors face most often. It's lack of motivation.
Oh, yeah.
This is when a staff member has the skills, the resources, and the ability to do the job well, but they're simply not putting in the effort consistently.
Oh, yeah. I think we've all encountered that at some point. Yeah. So how do we tackle that, that tricky situation using evidence-based practices?
Oh, the guidebook recommends a 2-step approach.
Right.
First, we provide performance feedback.
Okay.
And if that doesn't lead to improvement, then we might need to consider disciplinary action.
Okay, so let's break that down, starting with performance feedback. What does that look like in this context? So we're talking about like sitting down with the staff member and having a conversation about their performance.
Right, but it's not just any conversation. There's a specific evidence-based protocol for providing feedback.
Okay.
That's designed to make it as effective as possible.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What are the steps?
So the first step is to begin the feedback with a positive or empathetic statement. You want to set a constructive tone right from the start.
Yeah.
So instead of launching straight into, you're not doing this right, you might say something like, hey, I've noticed you're really dedicated to the clients and you always go the extra mile, which I appreciate.
So you're acknowledging their strengths and their efforts before you kind of dive into the areas that need improvement.
Exactly. It helps the staff member feel heard and respected.
Yeah.
Which makes them more receptive to the feedback.
Right.
Then in step 2, you get specific about what the staff member is doing well.
Okay.
And this isn't just like generic praise.
Yeah.
You're pointing out concrete examples of their proficient performance.
So for instance, you might say, you're really great at building rapport with the clients, and they seem to really respond well to you.
Right. And then step 3 is where you address the area needing improvement. You can be specific. So instead of saying your data collection is sloppy, you might say, I've noticed that sometimes your data sheets are missing information or have inaccurate timestamps.
So you're giving them clear and concrete examples of what they need to work on.
Exactly. And in step 4, you clearly explain how to correct the behavior.
Okay.
So you're offering specific, actionable steps.
Right.
So you might say, to improve your data collection, make sure you're filling out all the required fields on the data sheet and double-check your timestamps before you submit them.
So you're not just pointing out the problem, you're also giving them the tools to fix it.
Right. Step 5 is all about ensuring understanding. So you ask, do you have any questions about this?
Yeah.
This gives the staff member an opportunity to clarify anything that's unclear or to ask for additional support.
That's important because sometimes I think we assume people understand what we're saying when they really don't.
Absolutely. And then in step 6, you outline what will happen next.
Okay.
So will you observe them again tomorrow? Will you provide further feedback at a later date?
Right.
It's important to be clear about the next steps so the staff member knows what to expect. And finally, step 7 kind of mirrors step 1. You end on a positive or empathetic note.
Okay.
So you might say something like, I'm confident that you can implement these changes and I'm here to support you along the way.
Nice.
That's the gist of the evidence-based feedback protocol.
Cool.
It's a structured and supportive approach that's designed to help staff improve their performance.
It sounds like a really valuable tool, and it's great that it emphasizes both acknowledging strengths and providing, specific guidance for improvement.
It's all about finding that balance.
Yeah.
But what happens if you've provided feedback multiple times and you're still not seeing any improvement?
Right.
That's when we might need to consider disciplinary action.
Okay, so let's talk about that. What does disciplinary action look like in the context of ABA supervision?
Well, first, it's important to emphasize that disciplinary action should always be a last resort.
Okay.
It's not something we jump to lightly.
Right.
It should only be used after all other efforts to improve performance have been exhausted.
So you've tried providing feedback, you've tried offering additional support, you've maybe even explored accommodations or reassignment, and nothing's working.
Right. And even then, it's important to follow your agency's specific policies and procedures for disciplinary action.
Right.
This typically involves a series of escalating steps,
Right.
starting with a verbal warning, then a written warning, and then possibly suspension or even termination.
So it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It depends on the severity of the performance issue and the agency's policies.
Exactly. And it's also important to document everything carefully.
Yeah.
Keep detailed records of your feedback, the staff member's response, and any actions you take.
Right.
This documentation can be crucial if you ever need to defend your decisions.
That makes sense. Now, the Guidebook also mentions that supervisors need to be prepared for potential negative reactions from staff when disciplinary action is taken.
It's true. Disciplinary action can be a difficult and emotional process for everyone involved. And it's natural for, colleagues to feel empathy for someone who's being disciplined.
Right.
And they might even direct some of that negativity towards the supervisor.
Right. So you might find yourself facing some disgruntled looks in the hallway or overhearing some negative comments.
It's possible.
Yeah.
But if you've been a fair and supportive supervisor,
Right.
and if you follow the proper procedures, those reactions are usually short-lived.
It goes back to building that that strong foundation of trust and respect with your staff.
Exactly. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about a situation that can be particularly tricky for supervisors to navigate.
Okay.
Performance problems that stem from issues outside of the workplace.
Yeah, this is something I think a lot of supervisors struggle with. You want to be empathetic and understanding of what your staff are going through in their personal lives. But you also have a responsibility to make sure the work is getting done.
It's a delicate balance. The Guidebook offers some good advice.
Okay.
Focus on what happens within the workplace. You can acknowledge that you're aware of the challenges the staff member might be facing outside of work.
Right.
But your primary responsibility is to address performance issues that directly impact their job duties.
So, for example, if a staff member is consistently late to work because they're having childcare issues, you can express your understanding of their situation, but also emphasize the importance of being on time.
Exactly. It's about setting clear boundaries while still showing empathy.
Yeah.
You're not a therapist and you're not equipped to solve their personal problems.
Right.
But you can offer support within the scope of your role as a supervisor.
Right.
And that means focusing on the work that needs to be done.
And sometimes that might involve, referring the staff member to resources outside of the workplace, like an employee assistance program or a community mental health center.
Absolutely. Now, I know we've covered a lot of ground here.
We have.
And it can feel overwhelming to think about all the different aspects of supervision. It's true. But I think the key takeaway is that evidence-based practices can provide us with a framework for effective supervision.
I agree. It's not about having all the answers.
Right.
It's about having a process and a set of tools that can help us navigate the challenges of supervision in a thoughtful and effective way.
And I think it's important to remember that supervision is an ongoing process. It's not something we do once and then forget about it. It's something we're constantly working on and refining.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's what makes it both challenging and rewarding.
Well said. I know you always like to leave our listeners with something to think about.
I do.
So what's a question you'd like them to consider as they reflect on this deep dive into corrective supervision?
Yeah, it's interesting. We talk a lot about, evidence-based practices and protocols.
Right.
But at the end of the day, supervision is really about human connection.
Yeah, it is, isn't it? You're working with real people with their own unique strengths and challenges. Exactly. And sometimes the most effective approach isn't something you can, find in a textbook.
Right.
It's about building relationships.
Yeah.
Getting to know your staff and figuring out what motivates them individually.
Yeah, I think that's where the art of supervision comes in. It's not just about following the steps.
Right.
It's about being flexible and adapting your approach to fit the situation and the person.
Right. And it also requires a lot of self-reflection.
Yeah.
You have to be willing to look at your own supervisory style and identify any areas where you might need to grow and improve.
So it's a two-way street.
Yeah.
We're not just helping our staff develop, we're also developing ourselves as supervisors.
Absolutely. And that can be a really humbling and rewarding experience.
Sure.
So I guess the question I would pose to our listeners is this: how do you approach building those relationships with your staff?
Yeah.
What strategies have you found to be helpful in connecting with them on a personal level and figuring out what motivates them?
That's a great question. And on that note, we'd love to hear from our listeners.
Yeah.
What are your biggest challenges when it comes to supervision? What strategies have you found to be most effective?
Share your thoughts with us on social media. We're always eager to learn from your experiences and continue this conversation.
Because let's be honest, nobody has all the answers when it comes to supervision.
Right.
It's an ongoing process of trial and error, learning and growth.
And the more we can share our experiences and support each other, the better supervisors will all become.
Well said.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the world of corrective supervision.
It's been a pleasure.
Remember, it's not about being perfect.
No.
It's about being intentional and striving to create a work environment where everyone can thrive.
I couldn't agree more.
Until next time, keep learning, keep growing, and keep those conversations going.